This is the second session of the course on sustainable development, and this module is entitled The International Politics of Sustainability. In this session, we will trace out the political history of the concept, distinguish among some of the ways that it has come to be applied in different parts of the world, highlight some tensions in these various conceptual formulations, and begin to introduce some key concepts. This session includes 6 short video clips, and you will be prompted when to pause the slides and shift over to view each of the videos. All of the video clips are accessible from the course website under the tab for this session. Let us start with the timeline presented here that identifies several key events that I will introduce in brief and then discuss in more detail in several following slides. While the concept of sustainability, or alternatively sustainable development, has a long prehistory reaching back to the late 19th century and indeed earlier, as we will see, for immediate purposes we will begin this discussion in 1972. The modern notion of sustainability was born at an international conference organized under the auspices of the United Nations and held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. Several dozen countries sent delegations of various levels of seniority to the conference. Some modest achievements were made in terms of institutional development, and a number of key declarations were announced. Nonetheless, given the politics of the era, most notably the Cold War antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was difficult to sustain much momentum, and after the conference, other events and concerns came to dominate the next 15 years. In 1987, a committee was convened, again under United Nations sponsorship, to formulate a new conceptual framework for thinking in a more integrated way about the overlapping challenges between environmental protection and international development. This committee, the World Commission on Environment and Development, was chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland, a former Norwegian Prime Minister. At the end of its work, the Commission issued an important report that we will discuss in more detail in a few minutes, entitled Our Common Future. The next event in this sequence was the 1992 Earth Summit, held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The Rio Conference was a much more elaborate event than the earlier Stockholm gathering 20 years earlier, and it gave rise to several path-breaking outcomes that we will consider shortly. On a somewhat separate political track, in 1997, the nations of the world agreed in principle to the Kyoto Protocol on climate change. The inclusion of this agreement in this timeline is meant to indicate that over the past 20 years, the concept of sustainable development has grown up in close correspondence with scientific and political developments surrounding climate change. However, we need to be careful not to conflate the two issues, as sustainability is a much more expansive concept and speaks to a broader array of issues than just the control of greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, in 2002, the United Nations convened another major international summit on sustainability in Johannesburg, South Africa, that was intended to be a follow-up to the Rio Conference 10 years earlier. The achievements of this event, as we will discuss in more detail, were extremely limited because of irresolvable differences between developed and developing countries and an inability to contain regional disputes. Because of the lack of progress in advancing a global sustainability agenda, it is likely that the Johannesburg Conference will be the last mega conference of its kind for the foreseeable future. We will now proceed to consider each of these events and agreements in greater detail to highlight how the concept of sustainable development has come to be infused with meaning and political significance over nearly 40 years. The Stockholm Conference grew out of expanding public concern around the world over environmental issues during the 1970s. In the United States, for instance, unprecedented social mobilizations took place around the first Earth Day in 1970, and the government passed numerous pieces of far-reaching legislation in response to a series of tragic disasters like the Santa Barbara oil spill and an outpouring of political action around air and water pollution. Throughout Scandinavia, and in Sweden in particular, both ordinary people and governments were becoming frustrated over what to do about sulfur and nitrous oxide releases drifting northward from coal-burning utility plants in Britain and continental Europe. These emissions were acidifying lakes and degrading forests in Sweden and Norway. Yet there was no legal mechanism available to the Swedes or the Norwegians to bring any pressure on polluting countries to curtail the discharges. This situation prompted the Swedes to impress upon the United Nations the idea of convening a large international conference designed to focus attention on environmental issues in general and industrial pollution in particular. At the same time, developing countries around the world were not especially concerned about the problems of industrial pollution in the strict sense. For them, environmentalism emanated out of a very different set of concerns where air and water quality were inseparable from the ravages of poverty. Despite the notoriety of the conference, only one country, India, was ultimately compelled to send its head of state. Indira Gandhi, president of the country at the time, made one of the more impassioned and memorable speeches of the entire event that spoke specifically to the connection between poverty and the environment. She said in part, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? It would be ironic if the fight against pollution were to be converted into another business, out of which a few companies, corporations, or nations would make profits at the costs of the many." To get a better impression of the Stockholm Conference, let me encourage you to pause here for a few minutes to view 3 video clips. The first 2 go together and were part of a news report prepared at the conference itself. The third video clip is an interview with Maurice Strong, the Canadian official who was the principal organizer of the conference and who, over the years, has served as a key sustainability policy entrepreneur. Welcome back. As noted earlier, after the Stockholm Conference, sustainable development became a victim of the Cold War. The international political system during the 1970s came to be dominated by the powerful rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as their numerous proxy states around the world. In addition, the oil shocks of 1973 and the latter part of the decade came to occupy prominent positions on the political agenda and crowded out other competing issues. While scientific conferences continued to take place around international environmental issues, little of this activity had any real political visibility. In an effort to recatalyze public attention on issues of international environmental importance, the United Nations asked Gro Harlem Brundtland to take the lead in organizing an international commission on the dual and heretofore conflicting issues of environment and development. The members of the commission spent 2 years traveling around the world, holding meetings with people from all walks of life, Native Canadians, African villagers, London business people. And at the end of this long process, the Brundtland Commission produced a highly regarded report entitled Our Common Future. Owing in part to the political savvy and persistence of Brundtland herself, this was not a report destined to gather dust on a shelf. Most significantly, the formulation of sustainable development proposed by the Commission came to be adopted as the definitive definition. The Brundtland Commission defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. For better or worse, and if you begin to parse this definition into its various parts, you will come to realize some of the problems. The notion of sustainable development came to be, especially during the 1990s and early 2000s, completely inseparable from this definition. It was for a time extremely difficult to find a book, a journal article, or a public statement on the subject that did not make reference to this definition. It merits committing this definition to memory. Another critical outcome of the Brundtland Commission is that it established a regular calendar for institutionalizing sustainability in international politics. The report stipulated that every 5 years, countries of the world would come together to provide updates to one another on their progress implementing strategies consistent with sustainable development, and that every 10 years there would be a major international conference to showcase these achievements. 5 years later, 1992 brought the first occasion for countries to come together to discuss their individual and collective efforts to move the pathway of global development onto a more sustainable trajectory. Approximately 200 countries sent delegations to the mega conference on environment and development that was held in Rio. Public concern about rainforest destruction in the Amazon was at its height, and Brazil tried to take advantage of its role as host to burnish its environmental credentials. I'm going to ask you to view another video clip on the Rio Earth Summit in a few minutes, but before doing so, let me highlight the most important achievements of this event. It was first of all a far cry from the Stockholm conference, which was, by comparison, a far scrappier gathering. In the intervening 20 years, the United Nations, and Maurice Strong in particular, had learned a thing or two about how to most effectively stage an event of this scale. A major output of the summit was a document entitled Agenda 21, as in Agenda for the 21st Century. Recognizing the extent to which governments are beholden to the status quo and prone to ignore innovative ideas, Agenda 21 sought to catalyze a citizens' movement that would create quasi-autonomous local sustainability planning committees. During the 1990s, local initiatives sprang up all over the world, and especially in Europe, often under the auspices of national green parties that were ascendant at the time, to challenge mainstream policy and planning thinking. Because sustainability remained an anomalous idea that was out of sync with the political ethos of the country, Agenda 21 never took root in the United States, aside from a handful of very small-scale social experiments. The second significant accomplishment of the Rio Earth Summit was the successful negotiation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. The UNFCCC was the first international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions. But because of resistance from the United States and oil exporting countries, the best deal that could be achieved at the time was for an entirely voluntary set of targets, which in due course proved completely inadequate in stemming the steady growth of emissions. Finally, the Rio Conference led to the launch of a new institution within the United Nations system, the Commission on Sustainable Development, or CSD, headquartered in New York. Despite lots of fanfare at the time, the CSD has struggled to establish its mandate to generate funding to run its activities and to achieve a workable relationship with the United Nations Environment Program and other relevant bodies within the UN system. With this as a bit of background on the Rio Summit, let us take another brief timeout to view our next video clip. Please pause this presentation here and watch the next video file for this session. We pick up now in 1997. By the middle of the decade, the inadequacies of the entirely voluntary targets set forth under the UNFCCC had become apparent, and European countries led a campaign to put a mandatory agreement into place. A conference was convened in Kyoto, Japan, to iron out the details of a new accord. Without going into the full details, let me just highlight here that the agreement established two groups of countries, so-called Annex I and non-Annex I countries. Annex I countries assumed mandatory obligations to reduce their emissions by varying amounts below a 1990 baseline. Non-Annex I countries, for the most part developing countries around the world, were exempt. The Clinton administration pledged to reduce American emissions by 7% below the country's 1990 levels, but never submitted the treaty for ratification to the Senate. In 2001, upon assuming office, the Bush administration renounced the agreement. This brings us to the final point on this timeline, the 2002 summit held in Johannesburg, South Africa. During the lead-up to the conference, there was some highly volatile diplomatic bickering over issues in the Middle East, and at a couple of points, there was some speculation that the United States was going to stay home. Ultimately, the American delegation did attend, but most of the pre-conference deliberations were sidetracked and delayed. It was not clear that there would even be anything substantive for the heads of state to sign when they arrived during the second week of the two-week event. In the end, the conference announced a goal of upgrading programs to provide clean drinking water in developing countries and to endorse a vaguely worded agreement to encourage sustainable consumption and production. Most non-governmental organizations that attended Johannesburg came away deeply disappointed that the conference had generated so few new initiatives or really established much of a foundation for moving the agenda forward in the future. Let's pause one more time for the last video segment, this one providing coverage of the Johannesburg conference. I need, though, to flag the fact that this clip was prepared by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WBCSD, which represents the interests of international corporations on matters pertaining to sustainability. And the organization holds a particular view that we will have an opportunity to examine in detail later in this session and at further points over the course of the semester. Contemporary interest in sustainability can be traced back to the late 18th century and early 19th century, when many of the institutional forms and intellectual currents that are with us today first began to take root. In particular, Thomas Malthus, a political economist of the era, gave especially poignant airing to several ideas that were circulating at the time regarding the consequences of unchecked population growth and the availability of natural resources. In his essay on the principle of population, Malthus provocatively captured this anxiety. He noted that the human population, which began in Europe to show signs of upward growth due to some elemental improvements in public health, tended to expand at a geometric rate. In contrast, food production only increased at an arithmetic or linear rate. It does not take a mathematician to understand what happens when an exponential trend is overlaid on a linear trend, and Malthus's readership was insightful enough to understand the implications of the juxtaposition of these interrelated phenomena. As food became scarce, competition would become pronounced, with severe implications for population. Indeed, the depiction here represents a more accurate way of drawing the Malthusian figure. As population starts to come up against the biophysical constraint imposed by the food supply, human numbers crash due to inevitable political conflict and intense struggles to survive. Food supply declines as the foundations of society erode under the pressure of inadequate nourishment. This kind of figure describing population booms and busts is actually quite common in the field of ecology, where there are untold case studies of animal populations thriving as long as there is sufficient food. Once the population begins to approach its food constraint, the species collapses until such time that the resource base has had a chance to recover. Early ecologists, as well as foresters during the latter part of the 19th century, largely in response to the abusive practices of industries like logging and fishing, formalized the essence of Malthus's critique within their framework of sustainable yield. This idea suggested that exploitation could not continue at a rapid pace without serious consequences to the productivity of the underlying resource base. A more prudent approach would be to determine the level of appropriation that could occur without damaging the reproductive capacity of the resource. In other words, sound management, or wise use in the terms of the day, required harvesting only the interest of a renewable resource like timber or fish, the sustainable yield, and keeping the principle intact to ensure adequate reproduction into the future. These Malthusian or neo-Malthusian insights were taken up in a significant way during the early 1970s in the form of a book entitled The Limits to Growth that sought to apply the then newly emergent tools of computer-generated systems modeling. The study was carried out by a group from MIT under, interestingly, the aegis of the Club of Rome, an organization comprising primarily well-to-do European business people. The analysis considered the interrelationships among 5 primary variables: population growth, pollution, industrial production, food, and natural resources, and projected the impact of each one on the others under various scenarios. The research team, which was led by Dennis and Danella Meadows, leading figures in the nascent field of systems dynamics, asked questions like, what would happen if pollution increased by 50% over the next X years? What would be the impact on other variables? Similarly, What would happen if population doubled over the next 100 years? How would that affect resource availability, food production, and so forth? The end result of virtually all of their projections was bad news. Even in scenarios where population and resource use grew incrementally, it meant that humanity seemed to be facing a future of declining food and an inability to maintain adequate levels of industrial production. In many of the scenarios, we seemed to be poisoning ourselves under clouds of pollution simply to keep industrial activity going to meet growing population and consumption demands. Despite its grim prognosis, Limits to Growth was translated into dozens of languages and became an international bestseller, not unlike Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, for those who are familiar with this volume and its impact on popular thinking. The Limits book defined an era of increasing anxiety on the part of both governments and the public, that then prevailing trends that in many instances have become more severe with the passage of time, were unsustainable, and that human beings needed to find a new developmental pathway. These anxieties eventually dissipated, however, over the past 25 years or so, but they seem to have emerged anew for a number of reasons in recent years that we will consider in coming weeks. Consideration of Limits to Growth brings us to the intriguing work of an iconoclastic economist, an ecological or biophysical economist, to be more precise, named Herman Daly. Daly's professional and academic career includes service for a number of years working in the Environment Department of the World Bank, and he's a recipient of numerous international awards, including the Right Livelihood Award granted by the Swedish Parliament as a kind of alternative Nobel Prize. Daly is currently a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. One of Daly's interesting insights is to ask the question, what is the relationship between the economy and the ecosystem? When confronted with this question, most people will intuitively respond that the economy is the major system with which we need to be concerned, and the ecosystem is a constituent part of it. In other words, that the economy is the superstructure that draws resources from the environmental subsystem and deposits waste back into it. This is the view depicted in the following diagram. I will stop here for a few moments to give you a chance to study the figure. Daly argues that the actual relationship between the economy and the ecosystem is more accurately captured by this alternative representation. Rather than the ecosystem being a subsystem of the larger economy, it is correct to recognize that the economy is in fact a subsystem of the ecosystem. Indeed, the economy, a system of entirely human creation, is embedded within the ecosystem, and the economy depends on flows of energy and materials from the wider system to maintain itself. Indeed, if we are fully honest with ourselves, we can conceive of a nested hierarchy of systems whereby the economy is embedded in society, and society is, in turn, embedded in the environment. I would contend that this is a powerful observation, one with profound implications for how we think about sustainability, economic policy, environmental protection, and a whole range of issues, though it is certainly contrary to everyday thinking across the full range of our economic and political institutions. Daly goes on to further observe that the world has changed rather dramatically over the last few hundred years. Back in an earlier time, when human population and its needs were fairly sparse, the world was relatively empty. The size of humanity's numbers and the demands imposed on resource supplies were lower relative to the planet's carrying capacity. We now, however, no longer live in an empty world. Rather, human population and its consumption practices, at least in relatively affluent countries, puts us in full world. Unfortunately, we continue to act like we live in a relatively empty world, despite the fact that our extant circumstances have changed dramatically over the course of the past few hundred years. We have yet to adapt our customs, lifestyle norms, and institutions to meet the needs of this new reality. We can assess the situation in more visual terms. In a relatively empty world, the economy is a small subsystem of the larger ecosystem. The economy draws energy and resources from the wider environment, recycles some of these flows, and emits other throughput streams back out to the ecosystem. However, because of the relative sizes of the two systems, the adverse effects of the economy are maintained at a manageable scale. In the current full world situation, the economy has grown to such proportions that it has begun to hit up against the biophysical constraints of the ecosystem, as we discussed in the last session. It is obviously impossible for any dimensions of the economy to exceed the size of the ecosystem for an extended period of time. The last video clip for this session is a short interview with Herman Daly, where he outlines his thinking on several of these points. We are about to begin the final segment of this session, and we will finish up now without any further breaks. The last conceptual foundation of sustainability that we need to consider here is the issue of the global income distribution. As most are probably aware, the world is characterized by a massively inequitable apportionment of income. The figure here divides the global population into 5 cohorts, or quintiles. Each band represents 20% of the global population. According to the World Bank and other international institutions, the top 20% of income earners in the world earn 82% of total income. By contrast, the bottom 20% earn only 1.4%. This figure is obviously referred to as a champagne glass distribution, with the vast majority of income finding its way into the hands of a relatively small portion of the global population. In comparison, the lowest income earners are concentrated in the bottommost portion of the champagne glass's stem. It is also important to recognize that this distribution has, over the past few decades, grown more unequal, more like a champagne glass, rather than more equal, as in the shape of a water tumbler. The discussion thus far enables us now to introduce the most common and widespread sustainability illustration, the famous 3-ringed Venn diagram depicting the environment, the economy, and society as overlapping circles. The central intersection represents the point at which all 3 of these objectives are being simultaneously and effectively pursued, and where no single domain, like the economy, is exerting unequal influence. A key feature of sustainability is how it engages with and variously interprets claims that humanity is running out of environmental space, as we also addressed in the prior session. Unlike environmental policy making, which is concerned primarily with keeping industrial pollution to politically acceptable levels, sustainability centers on assessing the scale of the human enterprise relative to ecological carrying capacity and balancing pursuits across the three different domains. The primary tool for making these assessments is called ecological footprinting analysis, and we will take up a more detailed description and discussion of this methodology in the next session. In the meantime, it should be clear that sustainability tends to mean different things in different countries. In particular, there is disparity between the way in which sustainability is understood in the so-called countries of the North and the way in which it is understood in the so-called countries of the South. In developed countries, dominant applications of sustainability generally highlight the need to reduce material and energy throughput. We can think of this as efficiency-first modes of sustainability. And this is the approach promoted by organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainability that produced the video clip we saw earlier about the Johannesburg Summit. By contrast, in developing countries, sustainability tends to be about raising living standards and uplifting people out of conditions of material need. We can conceive of modes of sustainability planning and policy making that are consistent with this idea as poverty-first strategies. There is a considerable amount of friction surrounding the alleviation of poverty because wealth distribution from developed to developing countries is not a politically popular issue among countries of the North, with the possible exception of the Scandinavian countries. At the same time, for countries of the South, wealth distribution is often the only issue that they want to discuss. Another way to distinguish different schools of thought is to differentiate between so-called weak and strong sustainability. To do so, however, requires differentiating among various kinds of capital. Ordinarily, economists and others identify three kinds of capital: financial, physical, and human. In this context, human capital is generally meant to refer to labor. In discussions of sustainability, it is common to recognize the critical role played by, in the first instance, social capital, the enabling capacity provided by effective interlocking social relations, and cultural capital, the repository of shared cultural meanings that contribute to effective working relationships. In addition, sustainability proponents give credence to what is known as natural capital, natural resources, and the ecological services that are provided by healthy ecological systems. For instance, the capacity of the natural environment to absorb carbon dioxide and to produce oxygen is an extremely valuable ecosystem service. If nature did not provide it for free, we would have to pay rather handsomely for this service to be carried out through some other means. There is a perverse tendency in mainstream economics and mainstream policy thinking to ignore natural capital and the services that it provides. We also tend to seriously undervalue or ignore in standard accounting frameworks social capital and cultural capital. Proponents of weak sustainability contend that there are no limits on the substitution of natural capital for other forms of capital. In other words, if we run out of trees, we can find a substitute for wood. If air quality deteriorates to unhealthful levels, we can substitute technology, perhaps in the form of individual ventilating backpacks, to compensate for this loss. Accordingly, under a commitment to weak sustainability, our central societal objectives should be to ensure that total capital is non-declining. In contrast, advocates of strong sustainability argue that there are limits to the substitutability of one form of capital for another. And our societal objective should be to focus in particular on protecting natural capital from declining below certain irreducible minima. We can gather these various ideas together to introduce in the final slide of this session the following diagram, which can help to organize different ways of thinking about sustainability. On the horizontal axis of this figure, we have the notion of weak versus strong sustainability. On the vertical dimension, we can distinguish between a global vision of sustainability that embraces sustainability on an international scale and gives strong support for the poverty alleviation dimensions. In contrast, the lower half of this continuum is more decidedly focused on local, lifestyle-based understandings of the concept. The resulting four quadrants then each correspond to a different combination of these two dimensions. Starting in the lower left-hand corner, the juxtaposition of a weak understanding of sustainability with a local vision results in what we will refer to as the eco-efficiency model of sustainability, where the focus is on striving for more efficient use of energy and materials, measures that are generally justified by a quest to save money. This is largely the WBCSD conception of the challenge. It is also inherent in the efforts of companies like Walmart, which have of late taken an interest in eco-efficiency, delimited notions of sustainability. Moving up to the upper left corner, this is the model of sustainability that I will refer to for the time being as global paternalism. Here we find some limited appreciation of the poverty dimensions of sustainability, but this model remains largely predicated upon a technocratic vision organized around more efficient resource flows, though this emphasis is coupled with an appreciation of the need for technology transfer and other assistance programs to aid developing countries make a transition toward sustainability. Current enthusiasm for green technology of various kinds conveniently fits within this quadrant. We will in future weeks come to use the term ecological modernization to capture the central tenets of this model. Shifting over to the lower right-hand quadrant, we find a third conceptualization of sustainability that is less focused on energy and materials efficiencies, but the combination of a local vision with a strong appreciation of sustainability yields the relocalization or lifestyle greening model. This model is a fixture in some mainstream environmentalist circles where the emphasis is on reconnecting local farmers with local consumers and privileging other forms of local commerce over those forms that take place over appreciable distances. The final quadrant then is comprised of a strong sustainability commitment and a global vision. The combination of these two values gives rise to what we will term the global partnership model of sustainability, where there is a pronounced appreciation of the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of the challenge. This brings us to the end of this session. The third session of this course will introduce some of the tools and techniques being used today to measure sustainability and to contrast the performance of different countries and regions.